8:47 hours, April 30th, 1943. Commander David Price froze at his ASDIC console aboard the HMS Crane. The sonar signature was unmistakable. U-boat. But something was wrong. The U-boat was too deep. Way too deep. 614 feet below the surface, a depth where depth charges rarely ever reached. And it wasn't moving. Not at all. Price grabbed the radio transmitter with trembling hands. In 3.5 years of the Battle of the Atlantic, he'd hunted 23 U-boats. But this one was different. This one was playing by a completely new set of rules. Lieutenant Commander Werner Henke sat in complete darkness in the control room of U-515, surrounded by 53 silent men who barely dared to breathe. The battery indicator showed 17%. The air quality was already critical. CO2 levels at 4.2% and rising. At 7%, the first men would lose consciousness. At 9%, they would die. Henke knew exactly what was happening above him. 40 British destroyers of Convoy Support Group B7 were circling like wolves. They were waiting for U-515 to surface, waiting for the crew to gasp for air, waiting for the batteries to die. But Henke had made a decision that would have driven any conventional U-boat commander insane. He wouldn't surface. Not in an hour, not in 5 hours. He would remain submerged for 18 hours. And either emerge as a legend or as a tomb for 54 men. The situation 96 hours before this moment had already been desperate. U-515 had attacked convoy SC-128, 520 miles west of Ireland. Henke had sunk 2 freighters, the SS Robert Bacon and the SS Winkler. 1,400 tons of steel and supplies destined for the Soviet Union now lay at the bottom of the Atlantic. But the price had been high. The convoy escort had immediately located U-515. What Henke didn't know was that the British were using a new weapon, high-frequency direction finders that could triangulate U-boat radio signals within seconds. And U-515 had transmitted. Henke had reported his position to U-boat command headquarters. Admiral Dönitz now knew where U-515 was, but so did the British. Commander Price of HMS Crane had received orders to lead the pursuit. But Price wasn't alone. Convoy Support Group B7 was the largest anti-U-boat formation the Royal Navy had ever assembled. 40 destroyers, 6 frigates, 14 corvettes. Together, they carried over 12,000 depth charges, enough explosive power to destroy a medium-sized city. And it was all focused on a single U-boat, a U-boat that was 220 feet long and carried 54 men. The British Admiralty had decided that U-515 had to be eliminated, not just sunk, annihilated. Werner Henke had become too dangerous. In just 9 months, U-515 had already sunk 8 Allied ships, 47,000 tons. Henke was methodical. He was patient. He would wait days for the perfect shot, and he always hit. The British called him the Phantom of the Caribbean because U-515 operated between Trinidad and New York like a ghost. But now the ghost was trapped, or so they thought. The first attack came at 09:13 hours. HMS Crane dropped a salvo of 14 depth charges in a classic diamond formation. The explosions were deafening even at 614 feet. The entire boat vibrated. Glass shattered. Men were thrown to the ground. Senior Lieutenant Klaus Bargston, the first watch officer, shouted damage reports through the boat. Stern hydroplane, 30% responsiveness lost. Port electric motor bearing overheating. Pressure hull intact. For now. Henke said nothing. He sat motionless, eyes closed, listening to the propeller noises above him. He counted them: HMS Crane, HMS Fleetwood, HMS Mignonette, HMS Lotus, HMS Poppy, HMS Stonecrop. 6 ships directly above them, and the others were circling, waiting. At 09:47 hours, the second attack came. 26 depth charges, this time coordinated by 3 ships simultaneously. The tactic was new, not all the bombs at once. Staggered, a wave every 30 seconds. Psychological warfare. The crew could never relax, never take a breath. Every half-minute a new death threat. Petty Officer Otto Fricke, responsible for the diesel engines, began to hyperventilate. His hands trembled uncontrollably. Corpsman Hermann Knebel gave him valerian drops. It didn't help. Fricke was 19 years old. This was his second patrol. He had never expected to die like this. Slowly suffocating in a steel coffin while the world above him tried to crush him, Henke turned to him, said a single word: "Fricke." Otto Fricke looked up, saw the eyes of his commander. Henke nodded. No words, just a nod. Fricke exhaled, nodded back, and waited for the next explosion. By 11:34 hours, U-515 had already survived 127 depth charges. The British above were perplexed. Commander Price couldn't understand it. The U-boat still wasn't moving. ASDIC showed it was still there at 614 feet, but completely stationary, no propeller noises, no movement. How was this possible? Price knew that U-boats normally had to surface after 3 to 4 hours of submerged time. Batteries and air wouldn't allow anything else, but U-515 had now been down for almost 3 hours and showed no signs of panic. Commander Arthur Hewitt of HMS Fleetwood radioed to Price. "Commander, could it be a wreck? An ASDIC deception?" Price shook his head even though Hewitt couldn't see him. "Negative, Fleetwood. Sonar shows metal reflection consistent with a Type 9 U-boat. It's in there. It's waiting us out." Price made a decision. He ordered a carpet bombardment, all 6 ships, all depth charge racks simultaneously, 84 depth charges in 90 seconds. It was unprecedented. It was overkill. But Price wanted to be sure. At 11:51 hours, hell began. 84 explosions turned the ocean into boiling foam. On board U-515, the violence was indescribable. Men screamed, pipes burst, the lights went out completely. Emergency lighting flickered on, red. Everything was red, and the screams. Henke heard the screams of his men and felt nothing. No panic, no fear, just calculation. He knew that if he reacted now, if he even turned on the electric motor to escape, the propeller noises would betray them immediately. The British would be able to track their every inch. No, the only chance of survival was absolute silence. Dead silence. Bargston crawled to Henke through the darkness. "Sir, port cell number 7 is dead. We're losing 2% capacity per hour. At this rate, we have 8 hours of battery left." Henke nodded. "Enough." Bargston stared at him. "Enough for what?" Henke didn't answer. By 13:15 hours, 4 hours since the first attack, the CO2 concentration in U-515 had reached 5.8%. Dangerous levels. The men began to show symptoms: headaches, dizziness, slowed thinking. Radio operator Hans Schmidt collapsed at his post. Corpsman Knebel dragged him away, laid him on a bunk. Schmidt's breathing was shallow, his lips were blue. Knebel looked at Henke. The lieutenant commander looked back, said nothing. There was nothing to say. If they surfaced to ventilate, all 54 would die under British shells. If they stayed down, maybe 10 or 15 would die from hypoxia. But 40 might survive. That was Henke's calculation. 40 lives against 54. Petty Officer Fricke, now functional again, crawled through the U-boat, distributing soda-lime cartridges, calcium hydroxide that could absorb CO2. It would help. A little. Maybe by an extra hour. Maybe above on HMS Crane. Commander Price was growing increasingly frustrated. 5 hours, 243 depth charges, and ASDIC still showed the damned U-boat at 614 feet. Senior Lieutenant Michael Warren, the anti-submarine officer, made a suggestion. "Sir, what if they're dead? What if one of the early depth charges got them already, and we're just attacking a drifting wreck?" Price thought about it. It was possible. Possible, but unlikely. He'd hunted 23 U-boats in 3 years of war. He'd sunk 7. He knew the signs: oil slicks, debris, bodies. U-515 showed none of that. No, Warren, they're alive, and they're clever. We'll continue the bombardment. At 4 p.m., 7 hours into the nightmare, something began to break. Not the boat. The men, Seaman Gunther Pohl, 21 years old from Hamburg, stood up and screamed, "I can't take it anymore. I can't breathe. I want out." He ran toward the conning tower hatch. 3 men had to wrestle him to the ground. Pohl fought like an animal, screaming, crying. Nebel injected him with morphine. Pohl went quiet, limp, unconscious. Henke watched, still said nothing. But something shifted in his eyes, something dark, something dangerous. Senior Lieutenant Barston saw it, recognized it. The lieutenant commander was at his limit, not physically, psychologically. Henke carried the weight of 54 lives, and the weight of all the ones he'd already killed. 8 sunken ships meant roughly 180 dead Allied sailors. Henke remembered every single one. The screams in the water, the men choking on burning oil, those who simply disappeared beneath the waves, and now he was deciding whether his own men would die. In that moment, at 614 feet deep, in absolute darkness, Werner Henke understood that he wasn't fighting the British. He was fighting time, against physics, against the fundamental limits of human endurance. And he was determined to win. At 6:23 p.m., the depth charge count reached 407. Commander Price was radioed by the Admiralty. "Status of your operation?" Price replied. "Continuing. Target still active at 614 feet. No signs of surrender." The answer came after 20 minutes of silence. "Reinforce your formation. Support Group C3 diverted to your position. Additional 15 destroyers. Estimated arrival 11 Naga p.m. Price swallowed hard. 55 destroyers against 1 U-boat. It was absurd. It was unprecedented. But the Admiralty was determined. U-515 had to die. At 8 p.m., 11 hours after the initial attack, U-515 was on the precipice, batteries at 9%, CO2 at 6.9%, 4 men unconscious, 2 possibly dying. The boat was an oven, temperature 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Men lay in pools of their own sweat. Skin was pale, lips blue. Some were bleeding from the nose due to the extreme pressure and air quality. Henke sat motionless in the control room, eyes half closed, listening. The propeller noises above had changed, less coordinated, more scattered. The British were tired. 11 hours of constant attack had exhausted their crews too. Depth charges had to be manually moved and loaded. Each charge weighed 400 pounds. After 500-plus depth charges, the British sailors were physically spent. Henke recognized this, recognized the opportunity. He whispered to Bargston, "How many torpedoes do we have left?" Bargston took a moment. 4. 2 forward, 2 aft. Henke nodded. "If we have to break through, we'll fight." Bargston stared at him. Fight against 40 destroyers. Henke smiled. For the first time in 11 hours, he smiled. Not against 40. Against the next one that finds us. We'll take one with us. Bargston understood. If U-515 had to surface in the desperate nighttime escape, they wouldn't just die. They would show their teeth. They would bite one last time, and they would make it expensive. At 10:37 p.m., the depth charge count reached 553. Commander Price was at the end of his rope. His depth charge supply was almost exhausted. HMS Crane only had 30 depth charges left. The other ships similarly low, and support group C3 wouldn't arrive for another 23 minutes. Price made a decision. He would use the remaining depth charges in one final, massive attack. All or nothing, all 6 ships would drop their last depth charges simultaneously, 127 depth charges, the single biggest attack of the entire operation. If that didn't work, he'd have to assume that U-515 was already dead. At 10:51 p.m., the final attack began. 127 explosions in 180 seconds. The violence was apocalyptic. On board U-515, something fundamental broke. The pressure hull, a microscopically small fissure, opened along weld number 47 in the stern section. Water began to seep in, not a jet, a trickle, but constant. Chief Engineer Kurt Kroger shouted the report through. Leak, stern section, minor fissure. Pump capacity exceeded in approximately 4 hours. Henke opened his eyes fully for the first time in hours. Calculated, 4 hours until the leak became critical. The battery still had enough power for 3 hours of electric motor operation. It was time. At 11:08 p.m., exactly 14 hours and 21 minutes after the initial attack, Werner Henke gave an order that would make U-boat history. All hands listen. We'll stay down for another 4 hours, then we surface. But not here. Bargston looked confused. Not here? Where then? Henke pointed to the nautical chart. He had been studying the ocean currents the whole time. A cold, deep current ran northwest at 2.3 knots. If U-515 let itself drift into that current, motionless, they would drift. Silently, invisible to ASDIC, because there would be no propeller noises. In 4 hours, they would be 5.7 miles away, outside the British search radius. Bargston understood. It was brilliant. It was insane, but it might just work. Henke gave the orders. Flood trim tanks 2 and 4, equalize weight for neutral buoyancy. Then electric motors off. Complete silence. We'll let the ocean carry us. At 11:14 p.m., the propeller noises from U-515 ceased. The U-boat slipped into the deep current and began to drift. Up on the HMS Crane, Commander Price was confused. ASDIC still showed a target at 187 meters, but it was weaker, more blurred. Warren, the anti-submarine officer, ran a scan. Sir, that could be a thermocline layer effect, or the target is moving away from us. But I'm not seeing any propeller noise. Price cursed the technology. ASDIC was good, but not perfect. Thermocline layers, cold and warm water masses, could refract sonar beams like light through a prism. A U-boat drifting silently through such layers was almost invisible. At 00:47 hours, 16 hours after the operation began, Convoy Support Group C3 arrived. 15 additional destroyers. Commander Price briefed them. We've had the target under fire for 16 hours, 623 depth charges deployed. Target still shows a sonar signature, but position has become blurred, could be drifting. Commander James Richardson of HMS Bulldog, leading the new formation, asked the inevitable question. Price, is it possible they're already dead and we're chasing a sinking wreck? Price sighed. Possible, Commander. Possible, Richardson decided. We'll set up a systematic grid search pattern. 55 ships, each 2 kilometers apart, spiral pattern outward. If they're out there, we'll find them. What Richardson didn't know was that U-515 had already drifted 4 kilometers outside his search grid, silently gliding in the deep current. At 02:41 hours, 18 hours after the hell began, Werner Henke gave the order to surface. Stern hydroplanes to ascend, electric motors, minimum speed, slow controlled ascent. We're going to periscope depth. U-515 began to rise. 187 meters, 150 meters, 100 meters, 50 meters, 20 meters. Periscope depth. Henke went to the periscope, slowly rotated 360 degrees, saw darkness, waves, stars. No ships, no damn ships. He smiled. Surface, breach the surface! U-515 exploded from the surface like a whale taking a breath. The conning tower hatch flew open. Henke climbed onto the bridge, sucking air into his lungs. Fresh, salty, cool, delicious air. Behind him, men poured from the hatch, 54 men who had survived hell. Some were crying, some were laughing, some just stood there, breathing. Signalman Schmidt, who had collapsed, was alive. All 4 unconscious men were alive. Seaman Pohl, who had cracked, was alive. They were all alive. Henke looked at his watch. ZO2, 51 hours, May the 1st, 1943, 18 hours and 4 minutes underwater. A new record, a record that should never be broken. Bargston climbed onto the bridge beside him. What now, sir? Henke looked at the horizon. Now, we go home. Start the diesels. Charge the batteries. Course for Lorient. We won. Commander Price received the report at 6 hours. HMS Bulldog had found an oil slick at position 52 north, 23 west. But no wreckage. No bodies, just oil. Price knew immediately what it meant. They escaped. Richardson refused to believe it. Impossible! We had them surrounded. 55 ships, 623 depth charges. How? Price shook his head. I don't know, but they're gone. The report went to the Admiralty at 08 hours. The response came at 11 hours. Operation aborted. All units returned to convoy escort duties. U-515 classified as possibly escaped. Price read the message and felt something he hadn't expected. Respect. Whoever commanded that U-boat was a master. An absolute master. U-515 reached Lorient on May 9th, 1943. The crew marched off the pier with the pride of men who had done the impossible. Werner Henke was greeted personally by Admiral Dönitz. The U-boat command headquarters looked him in the eye. 18 hours underwater, Henke. How? Henke replied without hesitation. We decided not to die, Admiral. Simple as that. Dönitz nodded and breathed. Henke was awarded the Knight's Cross on June 4, 1943. The citation specifically listed the operation of April 30th, 18 hours of submerged combat against overwhelming odds. Proof that German U-boat commanders weren't supermen, but had something more important. Iron will. The British Admiralty conducted a full investigation. Captain John Waters, director of the Anti-Submarine Division, wrote a line in his classified report of July 3, 1943, that summarized everything. We must assume that German U-boat crews are physically and psychologically capable of feats we previously considered impossible. U-515 has proven our assumptions were wrong. This report led to fundamental changes in British anti-submarine tactics, longer pursuits, more depth charges, larger search grids, all because one U-boat survived 18 hours. Werner Henke led U-515 on 3 more patrols. He sank a total of 25 ships, 146,145 tons. He rescued 34 Allied sailors from the water after sinkings against direct orders from U-boat command headquarters. He was a warrior, but not a murderer. On April 9, 1944, U-515 was sunk off Madeira by American destroyers. Henke survived, became a prisoner of war. On June 15, 1944, he attempted to escape from Fort Hunt POW camp in Virginia. He climbed over the fence. A guard shouted, "Halt!" Henke kept running. The guard fired. Henke died instantly. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Section 15, Grave 384. The man who survived 18 hours underwater died after 40 seconds on dry land. In the post-war decades, the story of U-515 and the 18-hour operation became legend. The Royal Navy used it as a case study in their submarine training school. The U.S. Navy analyzed it in Annapolis. The Kriegsmarine veterans met every year on April 30th. The last three surviving crew members, Bargston, Kröger and Knebel, gave an interview in 1987. Bargston, now 79 years old, said a line that defined what they had gone through. "We died in those 18 hours, not physically but internally. And when we surfaced, we were reborn as different people. People who understood that the boundary between life and death isn't steel or weapons, but will. Pure, focused, unyielding will." Commander David Price met Senior Lieutenant Bargston in 1989 at a veterans meeting in London. Price was 82, Bargston 81. They sat together, drank tea, talked about the battle. Price asked the question he had wanted to know for 46 years. Bargston, what did it feel like? Bargston thought for a long time. Then he answered, "Like drowning without water, like suffocating without a rope, like dying without dying." Price nodded. Understood. Both men were then silent for a long time, remembering April 30th, 1943. The day 54 German sailors decided they would not die, and 40 British ships couldn't kill them. The technical analysis of the 18-hour operation revealed details that shocked even U-boat experts. U-515 was a Type 9 U-boat with a theoretical maximum submerged time of 8 to 10 hours under combat conditions. Lieutenant Commander Henke had extended it to 18 hours. How? Through rigorous discipline. Every man was allowed only 4 breaths per minute. Normal human breathing rate is 12 to 16 per minute. Henke had trained his men to reduce their breathing to a third of normal. That alone stretched the air supply by 200%. Secondly, all non-essential systems were shut down. No pumps, no fans, no heating, no cooling. That reduced battery consumption by 73%. Thirdly, Henke used the deep-sea current for movement. Zero energy. Pure physics. Fourthly, they deployed soda-lime cartridges that absorbed CO2. Fifth, and most importantly, Henke kept his men calm. Panic increases breathing. Panic kills. Henke allowed no panic, no discussion, no doubts, just silent iron discipline. Post-war analyses by Dr. Heinrich Lehmann, a German naval physician, showed that the U-515 crew reached blood oxygen levels that would normally cause unconsciousness, 68% saturation. Normal is 95 to 100%. Below 70% causes brain damage in most people, but the U-515 men had no long-term damage. Lehmann wrote, "The combination of physical training, mental focus, and will to survive allowed these men to transcend biological limits. They should have been dead. That they survived challenges our scientific assumptions." The psychological strain was immense. Dr. Margaret Fisher, a British military psychologist, interviewed former U-boat crews for a 1967 study. She found that 83% of U-boat veterans showed PTSD symptoms, but U-515 survivors showed something different, not trauma, transcendence. Fisher wrote, "The men who went through this extreme experience report not nightmares, but clarity, as if facing death had freed them from trivial anxieties. Several told me that nothing in civilian life could ever be frightening again compared to those 18 hours. Dustin Bargston described it this way: "When you spend 18 hours in a metal coffin waiting to die, and then live, you realize that everything else is just details. Job loss, detail. Divorce, detail. Illness, detail. I survived hell. Whatever came after was just life." Corpsman Kevin Knebel, after the war, became a psychiatrist. He specialized in trauma therapy. He used his 18-hour experience as a framework. He told his patients, "Your problem, whatever it is not as bad as 18 hours underwater with 623 depth charges above you. You can survive. you can thrive. Trust me, I was there. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of millions. Real men in a real boat, facing real destroyers with real depth charges. 54 German sailors against the entire might of the Royal Navy, and they won. Not through technology, not through firepower, through something older, something more primitive, through the refusal to die. If these historical truths matter to you, then support with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Every Super Thanks allows me to spend weeks in archives, to digitize rare war diaries, to interview last living witnesses. Help me preserve this history for future generations. Help me ensure that Werner Henke and his 53 men are never forgotten, that their 18 hours of hell are forever remembered as proof of human endurance. The legacy of the 18-hour operation went far beyond U-515. Every U-boat crew after that knew about Henke's achievement. It became standard in Kriegsmarine training. Commanders were trained to push their boats beyond previous limits. U-181, under Lieutenant Commander Kurt Freiwald, stayed submerged for 16 hours in 1944. U-963, under Senior Lieutenant Karl Bodenberg, stayed submerged for 14 hours in 1943. But no one broke Henke's record. 18 hours remained the peak, the maximum, the absolute limit of human and technical endurance in a Type 9 U-boat. British and American U-boat commanders studied the operation intensely. Commander Edward Beach, USN, who later commanded USS Triton, the first submarine to circumnavigate the world submerged, wrote in his memoirs, "Henke's 18-hour operation taught us that submarine warfare isn't just about technology, it's about psychology. The commander who can keep his crew calm under extreme stress is more important than the commander with the best torpedoes." Beach trained his own men based on Henke's methods: minimal breathing, maximum silence, iron discipline. These principles helped USS Triton survive its 83-day submerged circumnavigation in 1960. The story also reached the Soviet Union. Rear Admiral Nikolai Lunin, one of the most successful Soviet submarine commanders, wrote in a 1956 posthumously published letter, "I respected my German opponents, but Werner Henke was in a different category. What he and his men achieved on April 30th, 1943, was not war. It was art. Deadly, terrible art, but art nonetheless." Lunin had himself had a similar experience. In August 1943, his submarine S-56 remained submerged for 12 hours under attack from German destroyers in the Baltic Sea. Lunin survived, but he wrote that he constantly thought of Henke's 18 hours. "If a German can do 18, I can do 12. It kept me focused. It gave me strength." So Henke's legacy spread. German soldiers inspired Soviet soldiers. Enemies learned from enemies. Because excellence has no nationality. Skill respects skill. Courage recognizes courage. The final moments of Werner Henke on June 15, 1944, at Fort Hunt remain controversial. The official U.S. Army report states that Henke attempted to escape and did not respond to repeated warnings. The guard, Private James Morrison, had no choice but to shoot. But there are other versions. Fellow prisoner Corvette Captain Hans Meckel, who was Henke's best friend in the camp, claimed that Henke never intended to escape. Meckel said in a 1979 interview, "Werner spoke with me on the morning of June 15th. He told me he could not go on. The burden of all the men he had killed, the men who had died for him, it was breaking him. He said it would be better to be dead than to live every day with those memories." Meckel believed that Henke deliberately climbed the fence, knowing he would be shot. Suicide by sentry, suicide by guard. Whether it was an attempted escape or a concealed suicide, we'll never know. What we do know is that Werner Henke, who survived 18 hours of hell, died only 13 months later from a single bullet on American soil. He was 35 years old. He left behind a wife, Elizabeth, and 2 daughters, Ingrid and Greta, who never saw him again. Ingrid Henke, later Ingrid Schaefer, gave her only public interview in 1993. She was 60 years old. She said, "My father was a hero, not because he sank ships, but because he kept 53 other men alive while the whole world was trying to kill them." That is heroism. 53 families got their fathers and brothers back because of him. That's what counts. That will always count. The technical specifications of U-515 show why this achievement was so extraordinary. Length, 251.8 feet. Width, 22.2 feet. Displacement, 1,120 tons surfaced, 1,232 tons submerged. Diving depth, a maximum of 755 feet before structural failure. Henke held the boat at 614 feet, only 141 feet from the implosion limit. The crew of 54 men shared a space of roughly 30,000 cubic feet. That's 555 cubic feet per man. An average bathroom is about 424 cubic feet. Imagine living in a bathroom with constant machinery noise, limited air, extreme humidity, and the constant threat of violent explosive death. For months, that was U-boat warfare. And Henke and his men were masters of this inhuman craft. The 18-hour operation of April 30th, 1943 remains to this day the longest continuous submerged time under enemy attack in naval history. No U-boat before or since has surpassed it. Modern nuclear submarines can stay submerged for months, but they have unlimited air through oxygen generators and unlimited power through reactors. U-515 had batteries and compressed air, finite resources. And Henke stretched them to the absolute physical limit. What impressed you the most? Many viewers have shared incredible family stories. Grandfathers who served on U-boats, great-grandfathers who served on British destroyers, letters found in attics, war diaries that span generations. Share your family history from this time below. Every comment is a piece of history that we preserve together. If your grandfather was there, if your family was somehow touched by this war, tell us. These voices must not die. These memories must live on forever.